Welcome back, everybody, to another edition here. I get the pleasure of sitting down with Jesse Day of Commodity Culture. Thank you very much for joining us, Jesse.
Great to be here, Brian, and very excited to dive into the conversation today.
Me too. I cannot wait. I came across one of your videos, The Collapse of Canada and How to Get Out, which I thought was just an amazing presentation you did at the Cambridge House to a crowd in BC out there, which is, I can't recommend enough. The link will be in the description after. Please go check out this video if you haven't seen it already. Check out Commodity Culture channel. There's so many banger interviews on there. That's where I found you. So I guess my first question to you would be, did COVID break Canada, or was this something that was a long time coming, sort of as soon as Trudeau inherited the helm in 2015?
That's a very good question, because that's actually where I was going to start, regardless of where the line of questioning went, because I believe that event is what has defined Canada as it is today, in terms of if you're able to make a population accept what were some of the most draconian pandemic measures on the planet, which many Canadians didn't understand because they weren't traveling to other parts of the world at that time. They weren't really consuming the media of other countries. So they didn't realize just how extreme things were in Canada. There was only a few countries that were equal or worse, China probably being the worst, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Those were kind of the worst of the worst. Because if we look at even the worst EU countries, places like Germany, where things got really crazy, they did implement the passport system where you had to show something to go for dinner, but they allowed proof of prior infection, they allowed a PCR test, or they allowed an antigen test in lieu of a vaccine paper. In Canada, they gave you no options, which was absolutely insane. But in answer to your question, that's really tough to say, because interestingly, I didn't really start to wake up until COVID hit and these things started coming in. So before then, I was kind of like your average Canadian, not paying too much attention to what was happening politically, going, yeah, Trudeau's a bit of a weirdo, but he seems to be fine. Because again, I wasn't looking deeply into anything, just listening to what he was saying randomly. Sometimes when he'd appear on TV, and I would think, whatever, he's another politician, but he's not that bad. And everything seems to be okay from my perspective. It took the pandemic to kind of wake me up and realize, like, well, wait a minute here, something's off. And so a lot of people do point to Trudeau coming into power and putting a lot of policies in place that did cause a lot of damage to the country. And I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. But I think COVID was the event that completely brought to light the dark side of the Canadian people. And this is sensitive because, you know, I'm Canadian, but I think ultimately the problem is the Canadian people. I think that on average, and again, it depends where you go, but on average, I've found Canadians to be some of the most ignorant, arrogant people on planet Earth, who have no idea of anything to do geopolitically. They cannot grasp. You can put direct evidence in their face of all the wrongdoings and corruption going on in Canada, and they will literally say you're a Trump supporter. Or, I mean, I'm being a little bit extreme to make a point here, but that's the main thing that woke me up, was that after the pandemic restrictions started coming into place, and then after they announced you need 2 shots to go have a beer with your buddies, which is complete madness, I hadn't given up on Canada yet at that point, because I wanted to see how the people reacted. I thought, okay, they're going to try to do this. Maybe people will push back and there'll be a debate about it, and we'll be able to kind of meet in the middle, or we'll be able to perhaps, you know, move forward with more personal freedoms. Let's see how this plays out. Because at the time I wasn't sure. And what I saw was my fellow Canadians not only accepting this, but gleefully enjoying it as some kind of status or privilege, and berating or putting down those who would not take 2 vaccinations. And that's when I realized, doesn't matter, I have to get out of this country, no matter the cost. At the time, I was working for an investor relations firm in Vancouver. So I left in October of 2021. And I was not sure if they were going to keep me on remotely. I had already been planning for this contingency that I was going to leave. So I'd been saving up some money. I had about 6 months worth of living expenses in like a low cost of living country if I wanted to move. And that was it. I didn't know what was going to happen or how I was going to be able to make my way, because at the time my YouTube channel was in its infancy. So I wasn't really making revenue from it yet. So it was kind of a situation where I just said, it doesn't matter. I will literally, if I have to, figure it out when I get to whatever country I'm going to. I'll try to get a whatever low wage job there. It doesn't matter. Basically, this situation is so bad now that I will sacrifice anything to get out. And that was also a moment personally for me where I realized, okay, I actually value my personal freedom more than anything, because I didn't know that about myself until all of this came to pass. And I realized I have to get out at any cost. So in answer to your question, I think that things had been trending in the wrong direction. But what COVID and the restrictions surrounding it did was give the government moving forward a carte blanche to do anything, literally anything, because the population will just accept it, because they cannot not accept it, because the cognitive dissonance would be too great for most Canadians to turn around and then say, wait a minute, was all that stuff during the pandemic appropriate? Was that illegal? Was that, I mean, we look at what happened with the Freedom Convoy and the fact that declaring the Emergencies Act, the Court of Appeals has now said that was illegal. Well, nobody cares. So how does that matter? Nobody's held accountable. Think about this. The former president of South Korea has just been sentenced to life in prison, essentially. I believe 20, 30, 40 years, something crazy like this. And he's already in his 60s. So essentially life in prison for illegally declaring martial law for less than 1 day. And nobody got hurt. Nothing happened. Nothing bad happened. The army got mobilized, but there was no actual conflict with the citizens. Nobody got injured. Nobody died. And he just got sentenced to essentially life in prison for that. In fact, South Korea has a history of sending their presidents to jail, I should say, when they prove to be corrupt. But in Canada, there's absolutely no accountability, and there's no accountability with the people. That kind of starts with the people. If nobody's really willing to care about that, and the problem with Canadians, or a lot of them, is that they have this idealized view of Canada as a country. Thank God we're not America. That's always the thought. Those Americans, they're so stupid. They have Trump. How evil is Trump? I believe Trump is evil. I think he's probably the worst president in U.S. history at this point.
I think a lot of people would agree with you.
Yeah, but what does that have to do with what's going on in Canada? You know what I mean? And so we've entered this stage now where the population is not willing to push back, because like I said, it's a cognitive dissonance. If you dedicated your whole life to following these government objectives during the pandemic, and not only that, but ostracizing and bullying others who didn't follow them, no matter how ridiculous they were, you cannot look back and correct yourself and say, I did. I'm sure some people have. It's not impossible, but it takes a really special type of human to do all of that, to go through with something that's that evil, and then to turn around and say, you know what, I'm totally wrong. How can I write this? Or I should apologize to the people that I turned away because they didn't want to take the shot. So until I'll just add one more caveat, because this is a bit of a rant, but the last thing I want to add is the fact that during the pandemic, and what ultimately triggered me to leave sooner than I wanted to, was the fact that the government committed one of the most brutal crimes in modern history of any G7 or modern Western democracy, which is to stop people from leaving the country if they didn't take 2 shots. That was literally evil beyond any measure, because Australia did the opposite. By the way, Australia and Canada were very lockstep with the policies they were implementing, leading me to believe there was some sort of communication. I mean, I'm sure there was a communication happening globally, but interestingly, that there seemed to be a big connection there. Australia wouldn't let their citizens in the country, which is also completely insane. Both are completely insane in different ways. Until that's addressed, until we go back and say that was one of the greatest human rights violations committed by a country in modern history, and it was unprecedented and unethical and illegal, and who implemented this, and we need to convict them, and then we need to make sure everybody understands that this was wrong. Unless that happens, it's over. It's absolutely over. Because to allow that to pass and then to now live in society, you're now living in a complete fantasy, in a fictional dystopian world where evil is good and good is evil. And actually, maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, but I believe that the people who are manipulating Canada from behind the scenes have an objective to turn evil into virtue and vice versa. And that's behind a lot of the policies you're seeing implemented in Canada today.
Man, there is so much to unpack there, but I don't think I could have said much of that better myself. The only thing I would add to it, coming from the perspective of a still serving but soon to be releasing vet at the time, was watching the government. And I've learned this through ATIP requests. Like, I used to be I was an infantry officer, police officer, intelligence officer, or intelligence analyst, special operations for a very short time, sort of at the end of my career. But I know how to find information. I know how to follow patterns. And I found information that the government turned on the special operations community on the Canadian populace. And it was reported on very early in 2022. I didn't see it. But once I found that, I was basically checked out of the military. I was checked out of Canada for the most part. And like, you're nailing it on the head of people just willfully, blindly going along with everything. Like, again, the collapse of Canada and how to get out is such a good video. Please go check that out if you haven't seen it already. I do want to kind of pivot a little here to get into more of your expertise in the commodity space, because I think there's a huge thing here that a lot of Canadians don't know, and it's that Canada has zero gold reserves. Can you sort of dive into that a little bit and explain why that matters and the horrific potential side effects?
Yeah, it's a very bizarre thing. And that's why I outlined in my talk, it has to be by design to some extent, because the people who are running the central bank and the economists behind the scenes have to be aware how catastrophic it is, especially when we're living in a time in history over the past few years where central banks have been accumulating gold at a very rapid pace. Most believe, and I tend to agree, that this was largely driven by the US and its allies seizing Russia's FX reserves after they began the war in Ukraine, the special military operation, however you want to define it. And so that made nations around the world kind of wake up and realize, okay, we need a neutral reserve asset that is nobody's liability and that we can hold physically within our own jurisdiction, so it's impossible to seize outside of outright ground invasion. And of course, that is gold, which has been money for over 5,000 years, which has proven itself time and time again to be kind of an accurate barometer of the health of the global economy. And gold rising is often not necessarily a sign that gold is becoming more valuable, but that the value of the currencies are falling versus gold, which is essentially a measure, an honest measure of true wealth and true money. And so to not have that neutral reserve asset at all is tantamount to just asking for complete and total collapse if we do enter a phase where the fiat currency system is under duress. Now, it's interesting because there's a lot of hyperbole around this topic. There's a lot of people who will say, the US dollar's dying, or that, fiat currencies are going to hyperinflate all around the world. We're reaching the end game. And so it ends up kind of being an urgent message, and that gets a lot of clicks online. The truth is, we don't actually know how much longer this experiment could go on, because around the world, we've been under a global fiat currency system since the 70s, when Richard Nixon removed gold backing from the dollar. We've never been in a time in human history where there's literally been no currency that is backed by gold whatsoever, because prior to Nixon removing the dollar from gold backing, we had the Bretton Woods system, which was essentially, it's a little complicated, but to simplify it, it's that the US dollar is backed by gold, and most of the world's major currencies are pegged to the US dollar. So in that sense, even though those countries don't necessarily have physical gold to back their money, the US did. It was supposed to keep everybody honest. Obviously, we got into a situation where the US needed to print money to fund the war in Vietnam. And so that's a big part of what drove Nixon to go, you know what, let's figure out a way we can just print this stuff and we don't actually have to have the requisite amount of gold in the vault. And that created ripples throughout the global economy that still persist to this day. It's one of the most disastrous decisions and policies ever implemented, probably in modern human history. And the fact that Canada has not protected itself with gold means that if we do enter that end game scenario, if we do find ourselves in a place where fiat currencies start to hyperinflate, or even let's say the Canadian dollar starts to hyperinflate, which means that you get inflation at a massive level. I think hyperinflation is technically 50% in a year. But in many
something
cases,
something like a Venezuelan event over the last decade
yes,
or two.
Right. And there was hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. The classic example is the Weimar Republic in Germany post World War I. Hungary in the past has experienced incredible hyperinflation. So these events can happen, but so far they've only happened in isolated countries as opposed to a worldwide global phenomenon. So the thought is that if the US dollar, being the world's reserve currency, because of course, the way that the US dollar allowed themselves to keep dominance and supremacy over the world after removing gold backing is to go to the Saudis and tell them you need to sell all of your oil using US dollars only. And in return, we will offer you military protection. We will offer you this. And that agreement is what created the petrodollar, what's called the petrodollar, and has allowed the US dollar to maintain its dominance over time. So it's a simple fact that if we do experience hyperinflation in the US dollar at some point, that is going to probably cascade to many, many other currencies around the world, the Canadian dollar being one of them. And in that situation, you want to have gold to be able to, as a ballast, to be able to protect the wealth of the country, so that in the event of a currency plummeting, at least you have a real hard asset that in that case, in a hyperinflationary event, gold will go absolutely ballistic to the upside and act as kind of a protection mechanism against that. The classic example in Weimar Germany is that there came a point where you could buy a big house with an ounce of gold. And if you look over time in terms of purchasing power, gold has kind of basically over time held its purchasing power. So if you go back to like the Roman Empire, you could buy a fine toga and an outfit for an ounce of gold. And if you come to today, it's about the same. An ounce of gold will buy you like the finest suit, the finest outfit. And there's many other examples that you can look to throughout history where gold has essentially maintained purchasing power as fiat currencies have inflated. But Canada is playing a dangerous game by having zero gold reserves. And there's basically no other country that's doing that in the world that is a serious country. And that leads me to believe that perhaps it could be an intentional policy. And so if we were to see a total collapse, perhaps there's some sort of central bank digital currency system. I know they've been floating that idea, or some way to implement a system to create this digital slave network where they start to potentially introduce universal basic income and these different types of things where here is your new Canada Fed wallet, whatever it's going to be. They would then get people to buy in by giving them $1,000 for free. The Canadian government likes to give out these little bits of money to people that is already stolen from them through inflation, which is so crazy to me. We're going to give you a grocery support of whatever, hundreds of dollars or $1,000, but the inflation you caused is worse than the money you're giving. So it's like, you're just punishing me a little bit less. So they could potentially do that, introduce some type of CBDC, get the population to buy into it, which Canadians would buy into it right away. They'd be lining up for it.
Do you think it's likely that that'll come? Because that was actually my next question, so that's perfect. Do you think it's likely we'll see that, maybe not necessarily the hyperinflation piece, but CBDC, stablecoin, all of it's programmable, surveillable, you drive too much, you eat too much beef, they turn it off kind of thing. Do you think that's coming?
So that the whole driving too much and reducing your carbon, that could be a possibility. I don't see them launching that in a near-term time frame. I see them slowly trickling because that's how governments work when they want to implement radical policies. They do a little bit at a time. And one of the strategies I've heard of, which the Canadian government has certainly implemented and which makes sense, is you push it a little too far, you let some backlash happen, and then you step back 50%. So you only wanted that 50% to begin with. So you push to 100 and then people complain or push back, and then you bring it back to the 50%, which you wanted to begin with. So it's a super effective method of getting people to accept restrictions and limitations in a step-by-step method. And so I think that they'll probably slowly roll it out. At first, they'll probably launch it with some sort of, like I said, a free incentive $500 if you sign up within this time frame. And then once you're in the system, they can kind of more easily start to offer you incentives to receive payment in this digital wallet as opposed to regular dollars. So there could be a scenario where we have regular Canadian dollars and this central bank digital currency running parallel. And then the goal would be to eventually phase out the Canadian dollars. And they could do that slowly over time through incentives and restrictions until we eventually get to a point where, you know, they can put time limits on it. These restrictions, like you're talking about, you can only use it to purchase certain items. You know, of course, you want to be a conscientious environmental person. So you're only allowed to buy a certain amount of product X or Y, depending on how much carbon is calculated to emit. This is all, ultimately, these people want to enslave the population and they want to depopulate Canada as much as possible, because it's much easier to rule over the ashes and just extract wealth as much as possible from the smaller group of slaves that's left. I know this stuff sounds extreme, and it took me a while to get where I am today, of kind of digging into it and thinking about it deeply. But when you think about policies being implemented in Canada, the catch and release of dangerous criminals again and again, and this isn't unique to Canada, this is across the Western world, and I think the same elite network is behind all of it. But these catch and release, the increase in MAID, which we were speaking about briefly before we hit record today, and so many of the policies, if you think about it from the perspective of the people implementing these policies are power-hungry psychopaths. So they're devoid of empathy. They revel in the death of their citizens, or they want to kill as many people as possible. It helps them sleep at night. These are concepts people don't understand, but people have to understand psychopathy and how it works, and the extreme psychopathy of this network that has created the conditions under which Canadians are living today. When you look at it through that lens, things start to make way more sense as to why they're doing X, Y, or Z, because it's not incompetence. There's that old saying, never attribute to malice what you could to incompetence. I think it's actually the reverse in Western countries today. Whenever you think it's incompetence, you should look first to the fact that it's probably malice, unfortunately.
I heard you use the Hanlon's razor reference in your first video that I came across, and I thought it was bang on again. And I agree with pretty much everything you said there. And it's interesting to know that people in sort of the finance space like yourself are taking the time to think deeply about these subjects and consider what's hyperbole, what's realistic, what kind of time frame are we looking at. And then something you brought up again, and sorry to keep going back to this, but I love this first video so much, referencing Mark Carney was heavily involved in the Trudeau government when people's bank accounts were being switched off. So if you think that this was a Trudeau-led initiative, or Chrystia Freeland, you know what I mean, was acting with some kind of autonomy, like Carney was along for this ride and probably instigating and instituting everything that happened. And then the elbows up PSYOP happened, and we basically elected Trudeau again, but somehow worse fiscally, and leading to all of the problems and more that you just alluded to, which kind of goes very well into my next question here. So, like, why is Canada so historically horrific at managing our natural resources, things like oil, you know what I mean, mines that we often sell off or underfund in terms of exploration? Like, what got us here, and what can we do about it?
Well, things actually aren't as bad as a lot of people think, because at the end of the day, the Canadian government does realize how its bread is buttered, and they can't exactly go around completely shutting off the oil and gas industry, for example. They know that they need these industries to fund themselves and their own grasp on power, because if they were to just shut down all natural resources extraction, they would stand a big risk of losing their own power and their own wealth. So they're selectively shutting down certain aspects in terms of not building new pipelines, in terms of perhaps not granting permits in a timely fashion. In fact, permitting for the mining industry in Canada can be an absolute nightmare. Let's say you discover a gold deposit, and generally what happens in that case is the company that discovers it isn't the one that brings it online. They will then sell it to a larger player or to a developer who's going to develop it and bring it to production. Then perhaps even a bigger player comes in. So that there's a chain that happens there in terms of the ownership of that asset. But ultimately, when it gets time to build the mine, and you're leading up to that, the amount of studies that need to be done, the amount of Indigenous groups that need to be consulted with, depending on which area you're in, then you need to pay them all their cut. And then another one comes out of the woodwork at the 11th hour and says, wait a minute, what about us? We didn't get paid. Or somebody will object. And so the regulatory red tape is the thing that is the real stranglehold on the resource industry in Canada. So it needs to be massively deregulated. And that all plays into the government's command and control strategy, in that they need a certain amount of money to come from the natural resource sector, but they don't want to leave it completely open to business, because they want to control that as much as they can, extract as much wealth as possible from those individual projects. And they could care less if there's a project sitting on the sidelines for 10, 20 years as it waits for approval and goes through all these different environmental studies, all the red tape that's involved. So deregulation needs to happen. Interestingly, some of my largest investments are in Canada. I said that when I started off my presentation, especially because it was a bit stressful, because I was giving this presentation in between mining company CEOs who had paid to be there, Canadian mining company CEOs, to pitch their project. And it's like, okay, now here's XYZ company talking about their gold mine in BC or whatever. Now here's some guy talking about the country's about to collapse. But truthfully, I do believe that, yeah, it was kind of funny. But I do believe that Canada's resource industry is very investable, particularly the oil and gas space, considering how cheap a lot of these companies are. The uranium sector, the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, is the Saudi Arabia of uranium, the highest grades in the world, the largest deposits in the world. And there's a lot of investable companies in that part of the world. So it's not a lost cause at present. It's just that there's so much more that could be done. You know, I've heard recently that they imported LNG from Australia or something on the east coast of Canada, which is totally crazy. We have such an abundance of natural gas and such an abundance of oil that we should be focusing in and honing in on that more than putting red tape and regulations. But the interesting thing about Carney is, I think, in a way, he's playing both sides. So he's advancing projects. He's spoken recently about fast tracking mineral resource extraction, but at the same time, he realizes a huge part of the Liberal voter base are very extreme environmentalists. So you have to also, at any chance you get, talk about renewable energy, talk about reducing carbon, talk about shutting down oil pipelines or perhaps not building them. So I think in a way, he's being a little bit strategic about it, trying to appease his voters. And at the same time, we're moving forward to extract a little bit more of wealth from the natural resource industry in Canada. So I don't see a bleak picture for that as an investor, but of course, so much more could be done in terms of deregulation. And we need to start getting these Indigenous groups under control in terms of how much they're allowed to ask for and how many of these different groups you have to consult with. I mean, what's going on in BC right now is crazy, with, you know, land now being told, okay, this is now traditional Indigenous land. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it's getting crazy in that sense. But
you're talking about the Musqueam 2.5
yeah.
million homes in Vancouver being handed to a native association is what you're referring to, just in case the folks are not sure what's going on, but it's absolutely wild.
And it's wild, and it doesn't bode well for resource extraction in British Columbia in particular, because now that this has happened, it sets a bit of a precedent. You know, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, is the famous Charlie Munger quote. Now other Indigenous groups are going to be going, wow, okay, well, maybe we can get like a whole gold mine. You know what I mean? Maybe we can get all these resources now if we can prove that this belongs to us traditionally. So I'd be sweating a little bit right now if I was the CEO of a mining company that operates in British Columbia. And we just have to hope that this doesn't spread too much around the country and remains kind of an isolated incident.
So many good points there again. So because of this red tape that causes a lot of the headache and chronological delay, like the time frames always being pushed to the right, do you think that represents risk or additional risk to foreign investment that otherwise typically would be investing in Canadian commodities?
Yes, it represents risk to all investors, whether foreign or domestic, because you can look at these, you know, companies put out various economic assessments to basically try to describe the value proposition of investing in that particular company. So They find out, they do studies to find out what's the all-in sustaining cost of taking, for example, an ounce of gold or a pound of uranium out of the ground. And they provide a net present value calculation, which lets you know the value of the resources they have under the ground in today's dollars, an internal rate of return, which is a number you look at, a percentage that you look at to see if this is a favorable investment decision or not. And all of those numbers that people refer to can be meaningless if a mine never gets, permitted in time. So actually, it's the biggest jurisdictional risk in Canada. People talk about jurisdictional risk, and there's different kinds. There's AK-47 risk in places like Niger and other African jurisdictions. And then there's, and you also have the risk, of course, of government corruption, nationalization of resources. But in Canada, your big risk is permitting times and government red tape. It's a massive risk. So that means you have to be very careful and selective about which projects you invest in. How early stage are there? What is the relationship of this company with the government? How far along are they in getting their permits? What other regulatory hurdles remain in front of them? Because a company can have the greatest economics in the world, the greatest deposit in the world, but if it's not going to come online for 10, 15, 20 years, unless you're willing to hold for that long, and in the meantime, a whole bunch of other problems could crop up. I think it's something that all investors need to really pay attention to and to be really careful. So that's why ultimately, for most people, it's better to invest in a company that is already producing the resources and not an earlier stage company that's maybe in the exploration or development. They haven't moved through to the permitting phase yet, unless they're already well along in that process, or you can see they have a really good relationship there. These are all can be very opaque things to look into. But it's a factor that all investors need to consider when it comes to the Canadian resource industry.
I can speak from experience that I've had violent movements in stocks of junior miners that I've held with a press release of exactly what you talked about. It was a Native community, all of a sudden, you know what I mean, staking a larger claim or some kind of you know what I mean? They wanted a bigger piece of the pie of a mine in the area that previously, I guess didn't belong to them, or there was some kind of, like you said, opaque area that pushed the price way down. Then you have all these talks, and it just, everything you're saying, I've experienced firsthand. So I know exactly the pain and the delays that all this stuff causes. Without any of this being perceived as sort of financial advice, because that's not what this channel is about, and please don't take any of this literally. Like, are there companies you think now that are maybe a junior, maybe a major, that are either about to become, you know what I mean, very successful, or about to sort of break new ground in that area? Is there any you'd list specifically?
Yeah, so ultimately, I generally stay away from the junior mining sector, simply because I'd rather not take the risk, and the fact that I believe that we're in a resource bull market and we're going to see a lot of these commodities get repriced drastically to the upside. They already are. Just look at what gold, silver, and uranium have done. I don't think you need to swing for the fences. I'd rather get a comfortable 2 to 3x and take much, much less risk than go ahead and try to get into the weeds on some junior explorer or something that could 10x if it gets if everything goes well, but has a higher probability of going to zero. So I would direct most people to ETFs. I think that's just the best way to go. So for example, the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust, that's the premier physical uranium fund. So if you look into I think uranium has the best risk reward ratio, the highest asymmetric probability of it going to the upside than any commodity in the world right now. So if you've looked into the uranium story and you agree, why not just buy the physical uranium, which is the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust is a vehicle that actually purchases physical uranium pounds and stores them in warehouses and just takes it off the market. So that uranium is no longer accessible to utilities to power nuclear plants. So it essentially, it helps put the price up a little bit, but it's also just betting on the commodity itself. I would recommend the same thing with gold and silver. Just buy the physical gold and silver. Now, if you want to get into the mining space, you can buy one of the indexes. The GDX is the main ETF that holds a basket of the major gold miners. SIL is the one for silver miners. You could go into GDXJ or SILJ, which is more juniors, but at least you get a diversified basket of them. So that's where I'd look as a resource investor. But if we're talking about Canada and also oil, of course, there's several ETFs for oil companies. XLE is the main one in the US, and there's a few different ones for Canada as well. But when it comes to individual companies in uranium, I think you got to look at the giant, which is Cameco. They're in the Athabasca Basin. They're the second largest uranium company in the world. They are producing uranium right now. There's no other company in Canada right now that is producing uranium in any quantity that matters. So I would look to Cameco. And then potentially Denison Mines is most likely going to be the next company to produce. In fact, they've technically already started producing with Orano, which is a French company that is active in the Athabasca Basin as well. They're one of the world's biggest uranium companies. They own a percentage of a deposit there that they've started mining. So they actually they do have exposure to a certain amount of uranium production, but they are looking to bring their main projects online. And it looks like they've been given final approval or very close to final approval to move forward with construction. So that would probably be the next up and comer in the Athabasca Basin. You have Next Gen Energy, which has the world's largest, best, highest grade undeveloped uranium deposit like anywhere on the planet. In fact, it's one of the greatest resource deposits of any commodity on planet Earth right now. Now, their timeline to production's more like 2028 to 2030, probably 2030 or later, but they are the second largest uranium company in Canada by market cap size after Cameco. And because their deposit is so great, they are most likely going to be the beneficiary of institutional investment once more institutional investment starts to enter the sector as this bull cycle becomes more clear to the broader market. So those are the main kind of uranium companies, and that's kind of my area of expertise. When it comes to oil and gas, like I said, stick with the majors. Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus Energy. You want to get into a little more mid-cap, you can look at Whitecap, Surge Energy. The great thing about the oil and gas space right now is they're paying generous dividends, they're buying back shares, and they're paying down debt. That is their main objective, most oil and gas companies right now. So if you believe over the long run, the oil price is going to go higher and the natural gas price is going to go higher, you get paid while you wait. Some of these companies are paying 6, 7, 8% dividends. So if you believe oil's going up anyways, why not? And a lot of these companies are trading at very attractive valuations. Why not buy that, sit on it, get your dividend, let them buy back shares and pay down their debt. And as the oil price rises, then you'll get the re-rating in the companies to the upside. But the one caveat I will say to all of this is that if you're entering the resource sector, you have to be prepared to stomach gut-wrenching volatility. This is especially true in the uranium sector. It's probably the most volatile sector in the entire commodities market right now. But in general, you have to have a long-term outlook, and you have to realize that commodities are cyclical. So while you still have to have a long-term outlook, you have to realize this is not a set it and forget it type of investment, like investing in an index fund and counting your days till you retire, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. You have to realize commodities are cyclical, and there will come a time where prices get too high and they then tend to drop off dramatically on the other side. So you also have to have an exit strategy, and it's way better to exit the party early than to exit the party once the lights are shut off and the DJ's packing up his gear, because then it's game over.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'm very glad you brought up the energy sector as well, because as someone who sort of relatively new to this game, and I've done my due diligence, but I don't understand why, like obviously the Iran war is happening now. And I think when we booked this podcast, I don't even think it had kicked off yet. So oil's, starting to surge. And I know that can be a temporary effect at the beginning. But why in Canada are gas prices so high, or not so high, but starting to climb up with this Iran war if we refine and produce gasoline domestically?
Well, I don't know that all of Canada's gasoline is refined domestically. That's one statistic I would need to look at, because I'm not sure about that.
I think I looked it up. I think it's 70% is what Grok told me. So like the vast majority, I would say.
Yeah. See, that's interesting, because I don't live in Canada, so I don't pay attention to gasoline prices there. You've seen this rise since the war kicked off. You've seen a sharp increase. Is that what's happened?
Yeah, well, right now I'm in the southern US and it's definitely had a pretty sharp increase here, but I was paying attention to Canada and it's had a jump. I don't think as big of a percentage of a jump, but still a jump that seems to be unexplainable given that we don't need to resource our gas from anywhere where the refineries are being blown up. Like we have our own. So I guess what I'm looking for is like sort of explain to me like I'm five, why, you know what I mean? We're not paying, like the scarcity in Canada is not there, but we're still being gouged.
Yeah, interesting. Other statistic to look at would be how much of Canada's oil is imported, because like I just talked about this LNG deal with Australia, where a bunch of LNG was shipped to Canada, which makes no sense whatsoever. So although the refining capacity could be there 70%, as you said, I'm curious how much of Canada's oil itself is actually imported from other countries, which could certainly play a role. Now, as the oil price rises in general, we also have to consider that the cost of everything can go up because energy is the main input into everything that's going on, including deliveries, all of the food deliveries, the cost of producing food, the cost of producing everything. But that's interesting because normally these things have it takes a longer time for these effects to kick in, because oil surged recently. I don't know if we're around $90 or at least in the mid 80s as we speak. It takes some time for that to trickle down, I think, into the broader economy. What that might tell me is that inventory levels are low. And in that case, they need to buy oil more recently to then refine into gasoline. That's just a theory that could be part of it. I would look at how much of Canada's oil is imported, what type of oil it is that's being refined into gasoline. And if that's all coming from Canada or not. I would guess that's not the case. So those are some factors I would look at. Obviously, of course, we know about the taxes that have driven the prices of gasoline much higher than it needs to be as well. So those are just some educated guesses, but I don't actually have the answer.
No, that's fair enough, and that's more or less kind of what I expected to hear. But as someone who's not an expert in the space, it's good to hear from folks like yourself. Something else that I was sort of in the back of my mind that's been taking up a little bit of bandwidth is the COMEX manipulation and the lack of sort of government intervention. Do you have anything to add, or like what's going on there?
Yeah, so I have a lot of guests that come on my show that talk about manipulation of precious metals. It's a real thing. Markets in general are fairly manipulated. I mean, we look at things like the president of the United States releasing a crypto coin and then rug pulling everybody, and his wife release a crypto coin. You have, phone calls being made before certain events happen to industry insiders, people who are close to certain politicians, the politicians themselves who are close to CEOs of certain companies. And before events happen, you see markets move because those insiders are acting on insider information. So there's a ton of manipulation. Actually, we don't have a free market right now in the world. There's free market characteristics to it. And that's why it's so important as an investor to be paying attention to what policies are being implemented, to pay attention to what's happening geopolitically, what decisions are being made by those in positions of power, because you need to there's no way to predict these things, but it gives you a better lay of the land. You can't invest just thinking, oh, it's a free market and everything's just going to, the efficient market hypothesis. I believe that Eugene Fama and Kenneth French came up with this, and it's interesting, but it's nonsense, because at this point in time, we don't have efficient markets. There's mispricings everywhere for a variety of reasons. But when it comes to precious metals, there's a history of precious metals spoofing, which is another way of saying manipulating it. JP Morgan has been fined large amounts of money. Some of their people even went to jail for a certain amount of time. But it doesn't matter for most of these companies, because they essentially make more money on the trade than they do paying the fines. Now, the question becomes, how effective is this manipulation? Because we've also seen some shady things happening at the COMEX with our cooling system stopped working as silver was surging, and they had to shut down for several hours when silver dropped 26% in a single day. I've spoken to a few different analysts who say there's supposed to be circuit breakers that trigger once it drops more than a certain amount within an hour's time. And supposedly that happened, and those circuit breakers were never triggered. So that's also very strange. That would suggest that perhaps the COMEX itself is complicit in manipulation, in collaboration with these large banks and these institutions who take short positions and then essentially sell paper contracts into the market to drive the price down in massive amounts. That's essentially how it works. It's much more complicated than that. I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. That's why I asked the experts to come on my show. But it's a real thing. The good news is that the manipulators are losing the battle right now. That's obvious. We saw silver surge to well over $100 an ounce. It came back down, but it's creeping up. That trend is, if you want to take a step back, look at silver, gold, and these different commodities on a monthly chart, and you will see that they're going parabolic. It's up and to the right. It's only when you get into the day-to-day price action that you start to see, okay, wait a minute, it dropped a lot here, and you start to get wrapped up in it. That's probably like the one thing that I would also say to people who invest, not only in natural resources, but in general. Day-to-day price action is totally meaningless. So although manipulation is a real thing in the precious metals market, I think there's at least a decent chance that the COMEX itself is involved to some extent in at least turning a blind eye or looking the other way, if not outright active manipulation. But the physical reality is there. There's a massive paper market, futures contracts for gold and silver and many other commodities. So to some extent, you can play that game, but there comes a point where people need the physical metal. I mean, looking at silver as an example, it's one of the most used industrial commodities on the planet. And we're in the 6th year of a consistent supply deficit of silver, according to the Silver Institute. And it's very difficult to bring new production online because the vast, vast majority of silver comes as a byproduct of mining other metals. There's very few pure silver mines in the world. It's mostly a byproduct of copper, lead, gold, and some other metals. And so when you look at it that way, a lead mine isn't going to suddenly ramp up its lead production to get the silver as a byproduct because the silver price is going up. So it's very difficult to turn that on. And so I think we're going to see much higher prices in silver. I don't think it matters that the manipulators are there. If you want to get to the real kind of behind the scenes ultimate conspiracy theory, it's that governments don't want their citizens to know what sound money is. And so they're complicit in this manipulation to try to smash the price, to scare people out of it and be able to say, see, that's a bad investment. You don't want to put your money in that. Look at it, dropped 26% in a single day, you idiot. You bought it at 100. So they want to create this mentality that the government fiat currency is the only thing that you can really trust. Now, I don't know whether that's true or false. I have to believe it's true with everything going on these days. It's almost, you have to default to the conspiracy theory now before anything else. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the long-term picture, because eventually physical demand will overwhelm paper fantasies.
I couldn't agree more. And I too have to put my tinfoil hat on right before I go to bed every night so that I don't have to wear it around in public. But man, I can't thank you enough. Like I love the commodity culture. Again, folks, check it out. The show is great. There's so many good guests covering really interesting topics. And again, thanks so much for joining me. And I hope I can reach back out to you as this Iran war sort of progresses and we see where this goes, and maybe get some follow-up info on where the energy sector is going to go and what you think is going to happen.
Absolutely. I would love to. And I have plenty of controversial things to say about the Iran war as well. So happy to come back anytime.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And we'll catch you next time, folks.